Welcome to a study of the Gospel of Matthew, Part 2, Lesson 19. The Messianic King gives his followers some final instructions. Matthew 24:1 through 25:46. First pericope. Signs of the end of the age. Matthew 24:1 through 51. This chapter is somewhat difficult to understand in detail. The difficulty arises because it deals with two of the great days of the Lord. You will remember that a great day of the Lord is the biblical theological name for God's intervention in the history of the world that changes the outcome. Creation was one. The flood was one. The Exodus was one. And then you have the Christ event, which I prefer to think of as a single event with an interval between, because I think Jesus himself viewed it that way. He saw himself as coming to earth as the divine Son of God, doing the work and will of his Father, accomplishing the redemption of the creation, then returning for an interim period to the heavenly realms, and then returning at the end of the age. The difficulty that raises is that over the period of the 2,000-year history, close to it, people have mixed up the two events. It was confusing enough. The events around each one of, especially the event of the destruction of the nation in the Great Jewish War. This case, you have the destruction of the Jewish nation and the return of the Messianic King and triumph over his enemies. And then he will take his followers to live in the new creation. It is difficult sometimes to assign a particular verse or phrase to one or the other of these, because they're all great upheavals. When you think about it, there was chaos in the creation. In fact, it was chaos that God overcame by saying, "Let there be light." He created the universe and then said, "Let there be light." And so chaos is part of the nature of God's intervention in the world. That shouldn't be surprising, because chaos accompanies any great event. Alive during World War II, there was chaos. People trying to get on trains, people trying to say goodbye to their loved ones, people trying to get to work, people trying to make ends meet. So don't let it bother you. Just do the best you can in sorting these things out. The literary setting of this pericope is Matthew places it in the context of Jesus and his disciples leaving the temple complex. Immediately previous, Matthew had shown Jesus teaching and preaching in the temple complex. It's shown how that caused frustration and anger on the part of the Jewish leaders. And then how he would retire to Bethany across the valley for peace at night. They were leaving the temple complex, and it was an imposing sight. Of course, the temple no longer exists. Very little of the foundation even exists. But on both visits that my wife and I have made to Israel, we've seen the great model, and you can see how imposing it would be. It was towering above everything else in the city. And they were marveling at it. They marveled at the size, the beauty, and what they thought was the permanence of the buildings and walls that made up the temple complex. Jesus startles them by telling them that the whole temple complex would be totally destroyed. So much so that not one of the huge stones, some of which weighed 30 to 40 tons, would be left on top of each other. And you only have to go up on the Temple Mount and look at the barren plain. The only thing that's on the Temple Mount area is the Dome of the Rock, the Muslim building, temple. Beautiful building, but the rest is just like pavement, nothing there. Jesus' words were totally fulfilled. When they gathered together that evening in Bethany on the Mount of Olives, the disciples asked him two questions. When will the temple be destroyed? And what signs will occur at your coming to bring this age to an end? Jesus deals with the first question in Matthew 24, 4 through 28. He begins by warning them not to be deceived by the tumult and violence and confusion that will surround the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. We of all generations ought to know how confusing a civil war against where you've got irregular forces battling organized armies. We've been fighting for years, probably 15 years or more, wars like that. You have one area where the insurgents are winning. 5 miles away, the army, the organized army is winning. So if this description of that is confusing, it oughtn't to be surprising. Josephus, the Jewish historian of the war, confirms Jesus' description of the confusion that surrounded the destruction of Jerusalem. Jesus' first century Jewish followers used the memory of what Jesus said in this chapter to escape the destruction. Because during one of the periods when Vespasian had to take his army back to Rome, or at least the 10th Legion, they left Jerusalem while the Jews used the interim to strengthen the defenses. Really, the enmity between Jewish believers and non-believers developed right there, because the Jewish non-believers felt that their fellow Jews had betrayed them in their hour of greatest need. Jesus' answer to the second question, Matthew 24, 29 through 35. It's difficult to know exactly at what point Jesus begins to answer their second question. However, I am certain that he does answer the second question, because the language Matthew uses quotes from Isaiah in the Old Testament and other places, was agreed to by the Jewish scholars of the time to be describing the end of the Messianic age. So somewhere along there, between one verse and another, one phrase and another, Jesus, the original readers of Matthew, probably could have identified it, because it was a living thing to them. Scholars can only argue about it. And I would be the last person to say I know exactly where the transition comes. I know it comes. It's kind of like Jesus talking to Nicodemus. There is no way that you can read the 3rd chapter of the Gospel of John and know exactly where John stops quoting Jesus and starts making comments on what Jesus has said. Sometimes we misunderstand the nature of the text of the Bible. It's not a scientific or mathematical text. It's history. And history doesn't occur in little well-defined bits and pieces. It occurs as a flow of living experience. Thus, while it will always be difficult to know exactly when Jesus transitions from answering their first question to the second one, the meaning of the whole pericope is very clear. The end of the age, the present age, Matthew 24, 14 through 35. Verse 14 is seen by many scholars as being the point at which Jesus stops describing the destruction of the Jewish nation and begins to describe the end of the present age. He then covers the history of the period between the destruction of Jerusalem until his return in a single sentence. That's typical of the Bible. We are living in that interim period, and we think every detail is important, and in a sense it is. But from the perspective of eternity, Jesus simply describes the whole age in which we are living. The gospel of the kingdom will be preached to the whole world as a testimony. Shows that our experience is important, but that it is not outstandingly so, because it's our life that makes it so important to us. It also means that makes it highly improbable that there will be some special extended period called the Great Tribulation before the end of the age. That there will be some kind of hiatus in which it looks like the evil people will have won. It will be short. It's described as 3.5 days, half a week in the book of Revelation. The problem is that Jesus seems to begin describing the end of this age in verse 14. But many believers today insist that the language in verses 16 and 17 applies to a pre-tribulation rapture, which will take the faithful away from the earth to protect them from the suffering that will accompany the final destruction. That is simply a made-up. It's a fiction. I'm sorry to be that blunt, but my study over the years, I find no serious biblical evidence of that scenario. Because he said some people will be alive. This generation will still be alive when they see. There's nobody living now that will live through to the end of this age. But there were plenty of people listening to Jesus who were alive when Jerusalem and the nation were destroyed. Also, the language concerning the Sabbath and pregnant and nursing women, mothers, is much more applicable to the situation during the destruction of Jerusalem than it is to the end of the age, when the differing status of human beings will be totally irrelevant. Doesn't make any difference whether the end of the age comes on the Sabbath or not. There's nothing else going to occur after it, so it doesn't make any difference what day of the week, whether you're a nursing mother or working in a field. There's just not any biblical evidence for that scenario. Now, here is the important teaching. The day and hour of those events are unknown. Matthew 24, 36 through 51. Matthew intends for his readers to apply the teaching of this text to both the destruction of Jerusalem and the end of this present age. And that may be the reason that it's confusing to some people, because it applies to both. There's no way for people to know when the event was going to occur. That's especially important about the end of the age, because in spite of Jesus' teaching, consistently, he said, no person knows the day or the hour it will happen. And yet people persist. It seems like once a month or so, some preacher or scholar figures out that he knows exactly when it's going to happen. How many times have people been humiliated by making a prediction, getting ready for it, and then the event didn't happen? In both events, it will happen without prior notice. During the 66 plus years of my ministry, of preaching and teaching the Word of God, I've been constantly amazed by how many believers ignore Jesus' statement that no one except the Father knows when either of these events will occur. I confess that I don't understand such a mindset that takes the words of Jesus and ignores them completely. All the efforts to try to calculate when these events will occur would be better spent in being ready for them. And that was Jesus' purpose in saying these things. Jesus' answer to the people is, be ready always. I know that that's sometimes frustrating. We'd like to have a Sabbath rest from being ready. But it's the very nature of human experience that if you're not ready always, you're simply not ready. The Messianic King illustrates preparedness he desires from his followers. Matthew 25, 1 through 46. He does it with the parable of the 10 virgins. The basic theme of this parable is that regardless of the length of time Jesus' followers have to wait for his return, they must always be prepared for it. A secondary theme of this is that being ready is an individual responsibility. I cannot be ready for you, and you cannot be ready for me. The parable of the talents. The main theme of this parable is that God has given those who place their trust in him gifts that are unique to the individual. Therefore, he expects each one of us to use their gifts to further the work of the kingdom, the rule of heaven. A secondary theme is that believers must be ready to forgive the sins of their fellow believers. Then there's the parable of the sheep and the goats. Matthew 25, 31 through 44. The previous two parables concern the need for Jesus' followers to be prepared for his return. This parable concerns how his followers should act toward their neighbors while they wait. Please note that believers will be judged not on the basis of what they believe or teach, but on the basis of how they treat their neighbors. Shepherds often separated their flocks of sheep and goats from one another for various reasons. Hence, the separation symbolizes the separation of the faithful from the unfaithful at the judgment. Note, the separation had occurred before they appeared before the judge. This is another way of saying that all believers will be judged on the basis of the deeds they do in their daily lives. And notice the finality of the judgment is demonstrated by Jesus' words, eternal judgment, a judgment that will last into the age to come. If you're interested in making the teaching of this section your own, I have some suggestions. The main theme of this lesson concerns the return of the Messianic King to defeat his enemies and gather the faithful together and take them with him into the new creation. Jesus does not leave his followers in doubt as to what he expects of them, and standard by which he will apportion rewards to them. Contrary to common expectation, the judgment described here will not determine whether one will be saved or lost. That has been settled by the way believers have been lived, have been justified but on the basis of their faith, and is equivalent to receiving a verdict of not guilty. The judgment will determine a believer's degree of reward. The reward will be based on how well the believer has served their neighbors during their life. Therefore, to make the teaching of this section your own, you need to engage in a prayerful self-examination to determine the gifts God has given you. You also need to consult with your fellow believers, especially those you can trust, in determining what those gifts are. Continually engage in prayer, asking God whether you are using those gifts and ministering to your neighbor in the ways Jesus desires for you to do. Continue this process all of your life. Thank you.